Beef Market Update with Ann Wasco on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Haney Farms.
It's time for another beef market update here on Real Agriculture, and we're joined by Ann Wasco of Gateway Livestock again. Happy New Year, Ann. How are things in your part of Saskatchewan there?
Well, it's good. Happy New Year back to you, Calvin. Interesting market-wise, so we'll talk about that. But from a weather-wise perspective, I think we've had a very mild winter so far. Now this morning it's certainly cooler, and a little bit of snow moved through the area in the last couple of days. But certainly we've had a pretty good stretch as we head into January.
Speaking of weather, though, and the cattle market, those two things tie together with what we've seen in prices lately.
Right, and so even though we, here in Western Canada haven't seen anything as far as negative feeding weather or winter weather for that matter at all, that's not the case in the U.S., especially deep in the south, in the area where, of course, they're not exactly accustomed to nasty winter weather, and they've had some big recent snows, and of course, all through the Corn Belt in the south, they've been receiving moisture this fall and winter. One of the effects, of course, that they get in El Nino years, opposite of us, and it, of course, has created, there's been enough moisture now and enough snow and enough concern about cattle gains in the feedlots and loss of tonnage that it certainly is creating a market impact as we speak. So if you're wondering what the biggest change between the dismal market before Christmas and where we're sitting today, it's certainly weather related.
That's what's causing that rally in the futures when you look at the charts in Chicago?
Absolutely. Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How about closer to home in Canada?
Well, following suit, so first of all, just to kind of as a refresher, if you remember, the U.S. cash market got down to as low as 116 U.S. there before Christmas time, and last week's trade in Kansas and Texas was up around 135 to 136, so pretty big jump. We haven't traded cattle yet this week. Of course, producers, if they've got cattle ready to go, if they're able to move anything in their conditions, they're going to be looking for fully steady money, but we haven't traded. That said, the same kind of scenario followed suit here in Alberta with dress prices last week jumping up to $295 delivered, and that's Canadian. If you convert that back, that's kind of in the mid-170s. And again, if you remember trade before Christmas time, it got down into the mid-150s here in Alberta. So again, a pretty significant recovery along with what's happened with the U.S. And of course, the other piece of that puzzle, if you will, is the Canadian dollar and making new 12-year lows yesterday, continuing to support this local market vis-a-vis the U.S.
Mm-hmm. So with this weather-driven rally, is this a fundamental shift, or is this just a temporary blip in market?
Yeah. Well, I guess you can look at it two ways. Weather markets are real for sure, but they're not going to change long-term fundamentals. In the short run, they take beef off the marketplace and reduce tonnage, and that's where your bullish sentiment comes from. So it is what it is for today, but weather markets won't change the long-term trend for 2016, which we know means more protein in the U.S., and we're all expecting to see a lower price trend vis-a-vis what we came off of 14 in the first half of 15.
Okay. You mentioned the dollar. If we look at some of the broader picture issues in the headlines right now, 2016 off to a pretty shaky start economically.
Yes, and I think there's some things. It's going to be one thing to watch our supply and kind of the fundamental piece of the protein pie, if you will. The other piece of the pie that's going to be much more difficult to accurately predict, and I think we're going to be looking at some big surprises. So lots more volatility ahead, like we've already seen just in the first week of the year, with all the shakiness going on in global markets. Whether it's from the energy side or geopolitical or whatever the case might be, but certainly we've got some challenges there. And again, for a country like Canada that leans heavily on exports, we're of course faced with having to keep our eye on that ball all the time. So at this point in time, a shaky economy, even just here in Canada, and to a bigger picture across the waters is a concern. Now, the U.S. is, of course, one of our biggest trading partners, and they're, even though they're not going to be a bright, shiny light, they're probably the best shining light we've got right now from an economic perspective. So that will be a key market for Canadian beef and Canadian cattle, I suspect, in 2016.
Well, and then speaking of that, we've of course seen cool be repealed. How does that play out here in the next few weeks or months?
Well, the good news, Calvin's going to be now it will be the markets that dictate which direction cattle go and when and why, right? So instead of logistics of certain cattle on certain days of the week to certain packing plants, or feeder cattle to certain states, or all those kinds of things that certainly created a thickening of the border through extra costs, those are gone. So now it's going to be the market that dictates when and where cattle move. So it's quiet right now. There's not a big feeder run, obviously, as we come into the new year. We'll get started here in a month or so, and it'll be interesting to see which direction cattle prices move. It's been very volatile, so I think we'll wait to see what happens before me trying to suggest what that might be. But for interest's sake, looking at the fourth quarter of 2015, there was about 23,000 head of feeder cattle exported from Canada to the U.S. Compare that to the fourth quarter of 2014, when 137,000 head went south. So again, it was a very quiet fourth quarter as far as exports go. One of those key reasons was our market, even though it was down, it wasn't down as much as the U.S. market, and our price was still, in comparative dollars, still above that U.S. floor. So it'll be interesting to see, but it will be the market now, Calvin, that decides where those cattle flow, and we'll be very curious to watch those trends in 2016.
Yes, and I think that's where we'll wrap things up. Thanks again for your time, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Calvin.